I'm going to start by giving an apology, which is something you're never supposed to do when you're giving a talk. I'm going to apologize because I'm almost going to agree with almost every single thing that Michael said. However, one of the things which Michael pointed out was we're beginning to enter a completely different world of medicine. We're entering a world in which the boundaries which we had in the past will be completely different. Now, my background is also, to some extent, eclectic. I'm a researcher, really. That's what I started. I'm Medical Research Council trained. I was 20 years a research professor in Cambridge. I headed Imperial College for 10 years, which is a very strong research place. So I'm going to address the same sort of issues that Michael did, but from the research base. And also, I hope, give an explanation as to why this change is so fundamental, it is so important. And to put the added bit on, I also, for my sins, was chief executive of the United Kingdom's largest acute trust. So I know what the hell it's like of being a head of a chief executive of a health system, spending £2-3 billion per annum with all of the pressures that there is of in and outpatient care. But if we don't change this system is going to fail. And our healthcare parameters are going to go backwards. And I'm going to try and explain in the next 20 minutes why I think that's the case. The bit about Australia is extremely helpful because you've got the first graduate school here in Ireland. And in Melbourne, we created the first graduate school. And many of the aspects about creating the education that we require of our students in the future is honestly about graduate medical school. So you're in an extraordinarily great position to begin to try to address these challenges. But I think, as we would also say, for God's sake, don't underestimate the challenge. And in that circumstance, you simply cannot work on what happened in the past. You're going to have to jump off that cliff and just hope to God you can fly. Scary. So the health challenges, we all know too well. This is life expectancy, Ireland about in the middle, slightly higher than the United Kingdom. We know the issues. It's around diabetes, it's around chronic care. We know dementia's going up, and people at my age begin to realize that quite carefully. There's nothing like a list at my age, really important. However, joking apart, these are the challenges which we are facing. But underlying all of this is a fundamental change in science. And the bit that most of the public and most of the healthcare professions don't understand is that this change, the creation of a systems approach to understanding science, is fundamental to all of the changes which you're now beginning to address. And if you don't understand this, you don't even begin to understand the absolute core of why there are these challenges. So you've got, on the one hand, the consequences of the success of our societies, aging populations, chronic conditions. But scientifically, and the challenges that are going, and the tools that we're going to need to be able to fix this is actually based on this approach. Now, this comes from the American Academy, in which they've done a very, very detailed analysis of what's big data science, whichever way you want to put it. It's linked to developments in computerization, it's linked to developments in maths, it's linked to developments in engineering, molecular biology, medicine, healthcare systems, management practices. But as Michael was saying, what it isn't is it isn't isolated. So the whole concept of the new biology is a new biology of the 21st century. And frankly, if planners do not understand this, if they don't get it, they're not going to be able to deal with the needs of our patients in the future. Because it's very important to remember why one does research. It's very difficult when you're in a lab and you're doing molecular biology for this and you're wanting to find this pathway and you're interested in those SNP analyses and the gene changes here. You've always got to remember that the reason why the public are paying you to have great fun and great time in the lab, it isn't, strangely, for you to have great fun and great time in a lab. It's because they want to cure cancer, because they want to cure this, or they want something to be better. Medical research is totally different from disinterested research. Medical research is done to come up with a cure or an answer. It's not a disinterested pursuit of knowledge, unfortunately. It's a really hard fact, which 80 to 90% of our non-clinical colleagues need to understand. It's a real hard fact. The public doesn't do it for your edification. They do it because they want something back. And of course, what this is now leading to is a completely different definition of health. There is no such thing. When I qualified, which was shortly before Darwin, you had some conditions. Every individual, you'd have, you'd take a history, you'd do an examination, a couple of special investigations, and you'd be a diabetic. Now just think how ridiculous the concept of a diabetic. Just think how ridiculous the concept of just having breast cancer. How ridiculous the idea of just being slightly demented. We now know that there are systems within systems within systems that increasingly modern science can begin to understand. And worse than that, mathematics can begin to model. And once you can model, you can begin to change, because you can do the algorithms which allow you to get to this thing, and you can slightly change one, and suddenly you've got a completely different pattern of medicine. Now, the medical students which we're training today, in 20 years' time, are not only going to be, this isn't something which is periphery. This is something which is going to be absolutely commonplace. This is going to be the essence of the health which they're going to be practiced, not just the medicine. And of course that leads to, if you like, from systems biology to systems medicine. And there's a big argument about what you should call it. Should it be called precision medicine? Should it be called stratified medicine? Should it be called personalized medicine? But it's very important that whatever we call it, we understand what it is. It is the application of big data, the application of big science to big healthcare systems to deal at the end of the day with an individual who is complex in the extreme, if you like, at the other end of the quantum spectrum. So if you don't understand the systems biology, you won't understand systems medicine, and you won't understand health in the future. That's one heck of an argument for understanding what we are trying to talk about. Now, the first thing for a university is to recognize that all of those competencies and skills to do systems biology and systems medicine are not present in hospitals. They're actually not present in healthcare systems. They're actually not present in the Department or the Ministry of Health. They are present, actually, in universities. Universities have every single one of the competencies that I've put up on here. From the computational sciences to the maths to the engineers, here we are in an engineering building, to the practitioners, to the policymakers, to the strategists. All of those exist in a university. And one of the greatest challenges is, on the one hand, ensuring that universities use the competencies and skills which are going to be needed for the new type of health system without the threat to the university of suddenly becoming just a utilitarian organization whose function is to make the hospitals or the health system better. That is a really complicated political challenge. So this is just cancer, and I've chosen this because it comes from the American Association for Cancer Research. And it's very, very simple. As I said before, you think of cancer 20, 30, 40 years ago, bowel cancer, say. Bowel cancer basically was an operation, and basically 50% of people lived and 50% died. Broadly speaking, in cancer, it is still true, however, that surgery is the best form of treatment for cancer, the most successful. But having said that, you can see here that there are 8 or 9 different treatment paradigms, which are never going to be used, by the way, in isolation. You're always going to change them. And if you think about it, you're also going to change them within the context of that individual patient's care. So you give a particular form of chemo, for example, it doesn't work. So then you try one of the particularly exciting areas at the moment, in which Melbourne has just published earlier this year the seminal paper on immunomodulators and cancer treatment, absolutely, in the New England Journal of Medicine, completely transforming the concept of immunotherapy and cancer. I know there's a huge amount of work about it, but this is the first publication in melanoma and colorectal cancer, which actually uses big data to not change what the patient starts to treat. In other words, you can't just treat a cancer patient, because actually by the time you're into chemo, that doesn't always work. You need to be changing it maybe the week after, or the week after that, or the day after that, depending upon the patient's response to treatment. So that whole paradigm of, if you like, segmented care is going to have to change to a continuity of care, which we're going to have to provide for every patient. Just think how complex that's going to be. But that's just for cancer, and it's probably most developed in cancer. And the Americans very often and have been for the last 100 years at the forefront of the integration of health and research. It was the Americans, basically, who discovered bringing science to health. And we should not be sniffy-nosed about it, about saying, well, they just took this. They didn't. It was they who actually made that significant step. Only 70 years ago, there was a huge debate in Britain as to whether medical schools should be running medicine and whether the universities should be involved at all. That was 70 years ago, 6 years before Watson and Crick in 1951-53. And you just think of the change since then. Hospitals simply couldn't do it. Medical schools simply cannot do it. They are nowhere near the size and scope that are needed for the future. So, what is the impact of that on healthcare? And again, I can't agree more with Michael. It has to be based around the individual patient. And Michael Porter, who is probably one of Harvard's best-known professors, and I know Michael particularly well because this is a subject which has been very close to my heart for quite some time, has been trying to redefine what health is. And I don't want to read every single bit, but the point about this is the first sentence. If you get the first sentence, you don't need the rest. It's about the focus should be on value for patients. It's something that Michael said, actually. There are people who know the cost of everything, but the worth of nothing. And that's where we've gone wrong in health. We've thought something cheaper is better. If we can do it cheaper, we can do more. It isn't. It's the value that is brought to the patient which is the driving principle. Frankly, cost systems are cost systems. They're derived by us and they're influenced by us. We can change cost systems. Very, very difficult to change value systems. So rapid learning healthcare. We've got to move away from the idea of having segmented care. You go and see the GP. The GP writes a letter to the specialist. The specialist gets some investigations done. You then go back to see the specialist. They then do some treatments. Then you go back to primary care. How ridiculous. If you were starting from there, you'd say, you're mad. It's got to be an integrated system all the way through. And the big battle, to be perfectly frank, is not that people don't understand it. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It is actually the professional jealousies and the politics and the power which is actually preventing us from developing this. This is just an idea. This is from Abernethy and others, just looking at the how it works in the modern world. You think about how we've done research in the past. You do a clinical trial. You super select a group of people who, by the time you've super selected and removed them for this and removed them from that, this is a group of individuals you would never get together in a room. And then we do a clinical trial to show that it works, and then we're surprised when, heaven forbid, when it goes into the population, it doesn't work quite like we thought it would. And actually, 30% of all medicines given and prescribed to patients are never actually taken by the patient because they don't bother taking the full course. And 75%, roughly, of current medical treatments viewed overall, and I know you can define that, 75% have no scientific basis whatsoever. And that's the system we've got, in which we spend zillions of dollars in the States, and not an inconsiderable sum of euros here in Ireland, and yet 75% have no scientific basis, have no evidence that they make any difference whatsoever, yet we get into such a mess. And this is also looking at research. What will research look like in 2017? When I was starting out in the Medical Research Council, it took me 3 weeks to do a northern blot of TGF-beta of a uterus. And when I eventually got the X-ray, and to be perfectly frank, I probably was the only one who could see the faint. It's there. It's definitely there. You think about it now with sequencing, for God's sake. You do high-seq and you get the whole genome in, an afternoon and a bit of a morning for $1,000. So it's completely changed. And the idea that I, as a researcher, as a molecular biologist, when I first started, a clinician-trained molecular biologist, when I first started, if I didn't do the PCR or whatever, I was considered some sort of heretic. If I now went to, I wouldn't firstly know which end of a bloody sequencer to, I mean, I do actually, but I wouldn't be able to do it. My point is that the technology has raced ahead of our social and individual ability to integrate it. And that's a very dangerous position for mankind to be in a whole host of areas, but particularly in health. So it has challenges for the drug companies. We all know now the big blockbuster is very difficult to find because every individual, everybody is a personalized person. Everybody has your own genome. Everybody has their own epigenomic map. Everybody has our own SNP analysis, tandem repeats, and all the rest of it. We're all different. Every single one is different. There are groupings, but they're different. So the drug companies have a huge issue. And that is actually why the return on their investment is going steadily down year by year by year by year. And will continue to do so because the basic principles at stake, the level of science which we've reached, is the proverbial turning point. Now, when it comes to healthcare, there could be nothing more obvious that the integrated care has to be the system. As a chief executive at Imperial, the United Kingdom government introduced two things which seem to me to be ferociously, A, unfair, and B, very bad for the bottom line of the hospital. The first was that if any patient was readmitted after 28 days, they had to be admitted to the hospital at no cost to the hospital. In other words, if the general practitioners in my region of West London, which is the Hammersmith, Charing Cross, St Mary's, the whole of West London, if the GPs were totally incompetent and couldn't organise the proverbial drinks session at the brewery, I had to take the patients back at my cost and my expense. Nothing to do. And a system in which I'm held responsible for somebody else's actions never works. It always fails. It's a disaster. And yet, on the other hand, the GPs quite rightly could say, well, what the hell do you know about the complexity of primary care and integrated care? What do you know about the social care circumstances of Mrs. Bloggs, whose son, by the way, is in prison, whose husband's a drug addict? You know, how could you do that? Well, the bottom line is we're going to have to. This isn't one of those things you can say, well, it's jolly difficult. It is difficult, but it has to be done. Unless we get integrated systems. And I would argue that one of the difficulties of getting it in at the moment is actually politics more than anything else. And if we can try and resolve that, we actually get through. If I just think of my own profession, it's to be perfectly frank, it's the political professional jealousies between primary care and the hospitals. If we could resolve that in some way, it would be good. And I totally agree with Michael. It is not about, oh, well, let's try and work together. Let's try and make it better. The system is bust. We invented the National Health Service 70 years ago, and I personally am a very strong supporter, very left-wing, very strong supporter of the healthcare system. But it was invented 70 years ago when all of the health issues, all of the technology which I've just whipped through, didn't exist, didn't even exist. So we've got a system which actually most countries have, primary care, secondary care, all of these, what are becoming false silos, just isn't going to work. So it's the classic thing that when, it's the Keynes comment. If you look at an argument and you do it this way and then you get a huge amount of evidence which says, look, fella, this isn't working. A sensible person says, it's not working, we've got to change the system. And every country in the world, every developed country in the world at the moment is grappling with this huge, huge challenge. So what's that got to do with medical schools? We had a new graduate medical school when I was there. In Melbourne, you've got one as well. How are we going to train the medical students? How are we going to educate the medical students, or at least that part? And how are we going to educate the nurses? How are we going to educate the physiotherapists, the audiologists, the dentists, etc., etc.? So in Melbourne, I just want to go through just a couple of key points about the Melbourne graduate entry. This had nothing to do with me. This is done by the Aussies before I arrived. But I think you'll see that they put in a huge amount of thought, and I think it is an outstanding MD graduate program for the reasons which I'm going to go through now. The first is that they did a very detailed analysis of what you need to be a medic. And it's basically knowing about yourself. You've got to have knowledge. There's something about professionalism, which is extremely important. But you've got to also know about systems of healthcare. One very eminent public health doctor in the United Kingdom said to me, the analogy that he used is when he went into primary care and he said, what's it like this week? And the primary care physician said, well, it's extraordinary. I've had hundreds of people here with colds, coughs and flu. And he said, oh, I'm really overworked. And that's the limit. That's the bubble of his experience and competence. Whereas actually what he should have been saying is, clearly something's not right here. I'm getting a whole host of these patients. I wonder if my mate in the practice 2 miles away, is that happening to them? And then they ring up and go, yes, we've got lots of the same. And then you've got lots of the same. Then you begin to get a population-based public health issue, which actually is the way to try and sort out whatever it is. It's coughs and colds and or whatever. And that, to me, is a great exemplar of why the system doesn't work. And everybody gets cheesed off, because the GP gets cheesed off because he's inundated with work. The hospital's cheesed off because the GPs are referring. And nobody's actually going to the basis of what it is, which is an outbreak of some infection. Which, by the way, once you can do with PCR and all the rest of it, do the viriome or whatever it is, you can find out pretty damn quickly. We did a study team. We had one of the highest rates of C. diff at Imperial, and we had everybody went around making sure that the bedpans were clean and all the rest. It's crucially important that you do that, of course. But when we actually did the molecular analysis, it actually had arisen from an external infection from an individual's patient who had brought the disease in. We were able to go into the community, identify where the C. diff was, and then, of course, what you can say is, people from that community, you're not allowed in the hospital. Doesn't mean that if you're 10 miles away, nothing to do with that lot, you can come in the hospital. So that, to me, was a fantastic exemplar of using absolutely cutting-edge science to identify where the C. diff was coming from. The C. diff was not being spread a priori in the hospital. It came from outside, and then he put everybody together, and of course you get the inevitable result. So there are various aspects that our students are taught about, but particularly around systems. They're taught about, educated around society. But the crucial point is it's patient-centered. And that comes back to the other point, because politically you can't shift anything if it's just you or me or anybody else arguing our point. It's got to be around some shared central principle, and patient-centeredness works. Now, this is actually the Melbourne MD model, and I thought you probably would like to see this just to see how we've done it. You do have to have a basis in biomedical sciences, and when we introduced a graduate program at Imperial, we stipulated you had to have a sciencey type degree. It could be maths, could be engineering, but you couldn't come in with classics. That wasn't because we were picking on the classicists, and actually it was probably unfair and unreasonable. But even so, in a pragmatic reason, you've got to know about biomedical science. You've got to understand the scientific method. You've got to understand how to think scientifically. But you also then understand you need principles of clinical practice. In the States, if I remember, subjective, objective, health history examination, special. You've got to have some mechanism to help you deal with the complexity. You then have to do some specialist stuff. We split into women, children's, mental. That's for a whole year. The rest of it is mostly the physicians. But the bit which is absolutely crucial is at Melbourne, 2/3 of one whole year of the 4-year graduate course, the students do research. This is a truncated medical degree, so the amount of knowledge they're being stuffed with is reduced, and yet we still put as an absolute principle the idea that these individuals do research. Now, I was in Singapore before I left Imperial, and Duke have introduced a graduate entry program into Singapore. They have one whole year doing research. Now, why do that? Why waste time doing research for these individuals who are a bit short on the knowledge? Well, there are two principal reasons. Firstly, that form of rote learning knowledge, I'm afraid, is long since dead and gone. It doesn't work in the healthcare environment anymore. Just doesn't work. But secondly, when you're wishing to be in this profession, you're not being trained, actually. There are some aspects of it are training. How to take a blood sample, how to do an appendectomy, in my case, how to do cesarean sections, how to do a laparoscopic division of adhesions. That's training. But that's not what makes the difference. It's the education of my brain which is what makes the difference. And educating brains is not about what you think, it's how you think. And if we don't understand that, and if clinicians who are teaching medical students don't understand that it's the educative process which is far more important, because, by the way, you can forget what you learnt 3 weeks ago on the ward. You won't forget the way in which you approached that decision-making process and how you came to those decisions. And crucially, the bit which the medical profession really, 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 really needs to understand is we cannot anymore function in isolation without knowing what the results of what you do are happening. You simply cannot say, I'm a good doctor. I'm a doctor like anybody else, or I'm a good nurse, or I'm a good physiotherapist. I have never met a doctor who didn't think they were the best doctor on earth. And actually, or a nurse who's not the best nurse on earth. Because if we didn't have that self-belief, nobody else would believe in us. But joking apart, you do have to have metrics. And those metrics, in my experience, are actually extremely beneficial for the individual concerned. When you do use metrics, actually the vast majority do look pretty good. They're not the best necessarily. They can be the best, but they're still pretty good. So we've put that research as a really important thing. And when we've gone back to the students, we're just now getting the first reviews of asking the students on reflection 2 or 3 years down the post-qualified path, which is the bit of the program you really gave you most at this stage in your career. And, we didn't fix them, but it is the research phase that they say was the most enjoyable, but actually gave them the way of thinking which is helping them most in their current career. Because they're still at the point of their career where they don't know everything. They're still trying to grapple through that great weight of experience and knowledge which you need to become a functioning practitioner. And there are bits which go on, of course, there are specific parts and so on. But these are just what we add and have introduced into it. So coming to a conclusion, what does that mean for what can medical schools do for the healthcare system, as in what can the Romans do for us? The first is that I think we need to break down the barriers. We need to be thinking of education, not of training. Training is something which is a microcosm, maybe not a microcosm, maybe a bit more than that, but it's only a part of the educative process. And my point is an obvious one. If universities don't education, who on earth is going to? It is the function of a university to be thinking about minds, to be thinking about ideas, to be thinking about knowledge, to be thinking about how we think. Arguing, of course, different ideas and concepts, but at the end of the day, in the educative process, because we're talking here of how do we prepare people for the future, it is preparing them in a way in which they fully understand what real education is, such that in 10 or 20 years' time, when healthcare is completely different, they are educated to be able to respond, transform, and change the healthcare system that they've got. So I make no apology for agreeing with a lot of what Michael said. You have here in Limerick a healthcare system in terms of the population base, which is just about right. Anything between a couple of million to 10 million people seems to be okay. Anything above 10 million is next to impossible to organise. So you have a healthcare system which is manageable. The relationships seem to be possible that can be worked through and worked with. You've got a brand new health environment in which the various professions are coming together in a slightly different relational position. This is a fantastic opportunity, and I'm very grateful for being asked to come and have a look and see at ways in which this might go through the next 5 years of development. As Michael says, this is the most exciting time to be in the health arena for over 150 years. Enjoy it, but let's forget the heavy responsibility we have for evolving healthcare for the 21st century. Thank you very much.